Well, it is great to be here. I've been watching Frasier for years, so I know exactly what to expect. Somebody asked me, do you live nearby? I actually live in New York. I'm originally a West Coaster, though, so I feel some sort of affinity for the lifestyle and the values and the appreciation of things green, which are a little bit rare on the East Coast. Thank you all for coming, and thanks very much to Rich Lang and to the University Temple. It is great to be here. I think we're all in, if I can say so immodestly, for a treat, because I don't actually know what I'm going to say, which means that I'm going to enjoy the surprises as we come along, as well as everybody else. Now, the reason for that is because I'm out there day by day talking to people and investigating, and there's so much coming into me that I sort of feel like my head is exploding. It's I could write up notes, but any notes I had a few months ago from a talk would be completely irrelevant today because so much is happening so fast in the world. Everything really is quite a bit sped up. Usually when I give talks, I start and I tell a story of my fantastic voyage into the dark realm of politics. There was the adventure I had writing, researching, and then writing Family of Secrets. We've got some copies in the back there. It really sort of blew my mind because I had been involved in politics as a young man and then worked in journalism for many, many years, and I thought I knew everything. I thought I knew how things worked, and I discovered that I really didn't. And so often what I do with these talks is I sort of share some of the things I discovered, but I have noticed that the crowd gets more and more depressed. And then by the end, somebody says, well, this is really riveting stuff, but what can we do about it? And at the beginning, when I started giving talks a few years ago based on Family of Secrets, I didn't know how to answer that because I wasn't really sure what we could do about it, but I've been thinking about it because I've been asked so many times, and I have now sort of figured out what we can do about it, and I'm going to go into that, I suppose, a little more at the end, but I'm going to start with the end of my previous talks and just tell you, here's what we do about it, and then you'll find out what it is a little bit later. What we do about it is we take an interest in the truth, and then we share that by persuading other people that they need to know these things, and then all of us together take action. What I mean by that is if you take your own situation, you're at home and there's water pouring out from somewhere and it's filling the floor and you're becoming concerned that there's something wrong and you're going to have a big problem. And I'm going to guess you don't say, yeah, you know, water, not an interesting issue to me. It's just too boring, you know. It's just, you know, it just doesn't. It's not the Kardashians, you know. I'm not gonna pay any attention to the water issue. What you do is you say, oh boy, I've got a water issue. I better study this immediately and figure out what's going on and what I can do about it, and then I better take action. And the truth is that when you know what's going on in almost any situation, you sort of you know kind of what to do. If money is corrupting politics, you take the money out of it, you know. If climate change is leading us to extinction, then you take measures to change lifestyles and industrial output in order to address that. There actually are so many groups out there working to solve problems, and you know that. You're probably members of them. There are groups everywhere. There are thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of fantastic organizations working on every possible thing, and there are a lot of people with good ideas regarding what to do about them. So it occurred to me, as I said, over the years of being asked that question, what can we do about it? I realized the solutions are already there. The problem is that there's no action. And the reason there's no action is because most people are immobilized because they don't fully grasp the importance. They don't fully grasp that there are solutions. And I think they don't really understand how things work. And so what I'm interested in talking about is how things work. I became interested in it back in 2002, 2003. I was living in the Balkans, training journalists there in investigative reporting, and we were getting the first rumblings about a possible war in Iraq. It seemed very clear to me that they just wanted to go to war, and I wrote pieces saying that. And then the war happened, and living there, I noticed that the coverage of the war, I was able to get a lot more now you can get channels here, I guess, from everywhere, but back then you couldn't. But I was able to watch channels from all over the world, and I was struck by the difference, not just from Fox to these channels, but from CNN to these channels. And I said, my God, they're getting completely different stuff. And it just occurred to me that my own profession wasn't doing a very good job, or even a very honest job, of dealing with what was going on. And so the next thing that happened was everybody said, oh, well, George Bush either lied or somehow put out false information to cause a war. And there were no weapons of mass destruction. I'm sure you all remember that. And then I thought, well, he must be done for, because how could you possibly survive that? Well, by late 2003, early 2004, there he was running for re-election with good poll numbers. And then I saw that there was, who do we have, Howard Dean, and I thought, well, he's an impressive, articulate fellow. He ought to do well. And then it turned out it was going to be John Kerry, and I said, well, then it's pretty much all over, because here's Bush, where we've heard that he skipped out on his own military service, and here's John Kerry, this bemedaled war hero. And, the war hero is, at the time, was, more or less anti-war, and the guy who'd skipped out was pro-war. And I said, that's an easy one. It's going to be a walk. Well, it wasn't a walk. And then all these things started happening, like Kerry started having all these problems. And right when the focus was supposed to be on Bush and his being AWOL, they started looking at Kerry's military service. And they were alleging that he had somehow not really deserved his Purple Heart. And he'd been in the Swift boats, but he had lied about some of that. And I was just sort of amazed at that. And then we had this, the Swift boat veterans, remember those ads and so forth. And then there was that big explosion with Dan Rather and CBS News, which was about how the media was falsifying something, not about how Bush was falsifying. And I thought, somebody's up to something here. And they're very, very good at it. And I thought, maybe there's another way to look at how these things happen. Kind of don't take it on a retail level, but look at it a little bit more behind the scenes. And that's what I started doing in 2004, and that's what got me writing Family of Secrets. Around the same time, I also started a nonprofit organization, Who, What, Why, without any funds or resources, just because I thought, oh my God, I got to do my part to save the world. I mean, the journalism is not leveling with people. They're not telling them the truth. And if you don't tell people the truth, it's like they say that you need clean water to, there are seats up here up in the front. Please come up and be my friend. There are, they say that a village needs clean water or the village dies. Well, a democracy needs clean information or it dies. And this is what occurred to me, is that we don't really understand what's going on. And I know that because I didn't know what was going on. Now, if you read those Amazon reader reviews, there's always people who write, I read Family Secrets, it's pretty good. Of course, I knew all of that already. And I thought, well, that's amazing that they knew all these totally secret things. And they didn't actually know it, but many of us has this idea that we know that everything's pretty bad. So anything new that anybody tells us, we say, well, it kind of fits with what I expected. But we do need to pay attention to facts, and we need to marshal facts, and we need to be able to go to that Thanksgiving dinner with, Cousin Ed, who disagrees with us on everything. And we need to be able to articulately and without screaming, point out some things. And one of the exciting developments of all this is the tremendous response from people who are not what I would have considered to be my own kindred spirits, who are reading Family of Secrets, going to Who, What, Why, and saying, I had no idea of this stuff, or this has changed my mind. One guy came to one of my events. He had been the commander of the United States nuclear fleet, an admiral. And he said, I'm pretty skeptical of this stuff, but I'm listening to you, and it's interesting, and you seem like an articulate guy, and you're not drooling. And so he was willing to take a stab at it, and he did purchase a copy of the book and start reading it. And I heard from others that he was very impressed by it, and it was changing his way of looking at things. Because you have to remember, when you are very close to something, you don't necessarily see the bigger picture. I think this is true of a lot of people in the military. I think it's true of a lot of people even in intelligence organizations. Everything is so compartmentalized. They're so regimented. They're so focused on what they've always been taught that it's very hard for them to step back and to think differently. So one of the things that I've been doing while I'm here in Seattle is to try to find out what's on people's minds, what people care about, what are the sorts of things that who, what, why we ought to be covering, because our mandate is to cover the most important stories that exist. And apparently this is sort of a novelty, because if you think about the news, it's what I call the zone of low-hanging fruit. You know, I mean, did we ever hear a single news bulletin that actually gave us any information about that Malaysian plane? I mean, it's like they're running out the clock, you know, and, you know, Justin Timberlake did this, and, you know, the Kardashians did that, and so forth, and it's just, almost none of it is about anything, actually. And so we started talking about things like climate change and the growing plutocracy in this country, the fact that we elected a man who, what was it, hope you can believe in, or whatever his slogan was, you know, and you know, boy, but from that impassioned speech he gave in Lincoln Park to today, that's an awful long trip, and a pretty weird psychedelic one at that. Because he ain't the same guy. And then people say, well, you know, and so people either say, oh, I'm disgusted with him, or they say, I still like him. I still think he's a good man. And the problem is, he's not in charge. That's the thing that people don't get. And this is really what I discovered. This is what Family of Secrets is about, is that George W. Bush wasn't in charge either, because it's a culture. And there are thousands and thousands of people who are part of this particular culture, just like there are thousands of whatever culture you feel that you belong to, who are in another culture. And they work for police departments, and they work for corporations and that are involved with the military-industrial complex and so forth. And they have a very different view of the world, very different value system, very different appreciation of democracy, what it can be and what it should be. You know, their older relatives would just thought, you know, Francisco Franco was terrific, and you know, that Hitler had a few things to teach us, and so on. And so we there's so much propaganda about how democratic America is. Have you noticed that? There's more flag waving. There's more. I was on a radio show a few days ago, and it was a liberal show, nationally syndicated, but the usual host wasn't there, and they had this guest host, and she announced her liberal bona fides, and then she proceeded to talk about the Boston Marathon bombing, which I'd like to talk about a little bit, which we've been covering extensively on Who, What, Why. And she said, and you know, they invited me on to talk about the Boston Marathon bombing. I assumed they had read my stuff. Well, I guess she hadn't, because she said, don't know about you, but I am wearing my Boston Strong t-shirt. And maybe she asked me if I was, and I said, listen, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but I am just not into the propaganda and the myth-making stuff. I'm here to talk about what really happened in Boston and what it means about the way that they were able to basically declare martial law and force everyone to stay in their homes. This had never been done before in this country, that almost nobody spoke about it or asked about it or questioned it, not the media, and not most institutions either. Not all those great institutions of higher learning in the Boston area. Those should have been at the forefront of raising questions. They're full of constitutional law professors and so on. Nobody really said anything. And then almost immediately we heard that they'd solved this. Did you notice that? They always solve everything really fast. I mean, they do. They solve everything really, really fast. It's never like Columbo or Agatha Christie. They get it in a second. And so I was thinking, boy, that FBI is really good. I mean, they're so good. And then I thought, you know, when I was working on Family of Secrets and I discovered that George H.W. Bush couldn't remember where he was on the day that John F. Kennedy, when John F. Kennedy was shot, we could talk about that later if you want, or you could just read the chapters in the book about him and the Kennedy assassination. But I became interested in the Kennedy assassination, and I was struck by that the FBI was so incompetent that they had Lee Henry Oswald, they had Harvey Lee Oswald. They couldn't find the files, and I thought either they're incredibly incompetent or they're doing that deliberately, or some combination of the two, both, and any combination, all pretty bad. But guess what? Here we are 50 years later, and they're doing the exact same stuff. And we have an article on Who or Why I hope you'll take a look at about the report that just came out from the inspectors general of all these different alphabet agencies, where they are deliberately released at the time of the first anniversary of the bombing. And it's the most astonishing document, because if you read it very quickly, it's kind of boring and hard to fathom. You sort of get a sense that they say, well, they didn't do everything they could, but they did something, and there were some things we would do differently, and that's the end of it. By the way, that's what all reports say. You could just use the same report, year in and year out, because it always says the same thing. And so I thought, let me take a closer look at this. And then I realized that what these inspectors general were basically saying was their hands were tied. They couldn't really dig in. They themselves had been obstructed by these agencies. They had to black out or redact a whole section, the most interesting and important section, which had to do with what relationship, if any, might have existed between the U.S. government and the alleged bombers themselves several years prior to the bombing. Well, you would think people would be interested in it. The media was not interested in this. Well, nobody seemed interested in that. Well, yeah, they knew them, but they didn't know them that well. I mean, hello. I mean, it's just incredible. They'll lock a young black kid up for, allegedly once looking at a joint, and yet here you've got, the fire is awfully thick, not just smoke, but the fire's right there. And they say, yeah, well. And so I was looking at this, and I saw that this one FBI agent who had been interacting with the Tsarnaev family, I particularly loved this story, because when they wrote about what he did, here's what he did. The Russians said, we have some information about this kid and his family, and we think that he's involved with some sort of terrorist activities, and we urge you to take a look at him. Now, I mean, that's pretty much all the U.S. government seems to be in business these days, is Homeland Security. So you would assume, well, they jump right on it. Well, and I was thinking, well, what would I do if somebody tipped me off that there was a potential terrorist in our midst? So let me ask you quickly, what would you do if you got a report that there was a potential terrorist in your midst? What would you do? You'd investigate him. Okay, and how would you do that? By the way, there's probably one of you who does, but that's okay. Because they always like to come to these things for enlightenment purposes. Sorry? Okay. See, now, look how intelligent this man is. So he's already qualified to be the director of the FBI, because none of them thought of that. So what they did instead, they didn't put him under surveillance. You know what they went? They went to talk to him, and they said, are you a terrorist? I kid you not, you have to read this, And then they went to their neighbors and they said, is your neighbor a terrorist? And they were like, no, I don't think so. Girlfriend? No, not that I know of. Okay, clean bill of health. I swear, this is what happened. And then I think the Russians indicated that, he was going to maybe go to Russia or Chechnya and so forth. And he goes. And when he goes, there are normal flags that are supposed to be raised, and I know because they harassed me at the airport, and so they did nothing to him. And when he was coming back through, somehow the border people who were monitoring, who knew a little bit about him, the flag was taken down. In other words, he was supposed to sail through. And this was very, very important, because 9/11 was almost the exact same thing. All those guys were given those visas and stuff, and Michael Springman, the U.S. consul, was objecting over the years to all of these guys and he was saying, I don't, they're lying and they want visas, and I can tell that this is not kosher, a funny term to use in Saudi Arabia, but anyway, and the higher ups just ordered him to admit all these people. And that's how we got them all, in the U.S. Training to fly planes. And so it's a very similar thing again that they let these guys in. Now you say, well, what could possibly be going on here? And it seems to me, after years of studying this stuff, that really here's how it works. How does the FBI have such an incredible track record? How is it that they're always able to nail somebody? Anybody want to take a guess? They set them up. Okay. Something like that. Basically what you do, they remember the motto, the FBI always gets its man. And then it occurred to me, they always get their man because it's their man. They know these guys, they're in cahoots with them. They're going out for beers with them. And so it's a great system, but it's a kind of corruption. And it's just like, you go to have you take your car to the mechanic and, it's a racket, right? And they flip something, they tell you, oh, you need this and you need that and so on, and it's often not true. Well, it's not just car mechanics, and there are many honest car mechanics, and perhaps more higher percentage of car mechanics than people in one of these agencies, But it's easy to kind of dump on them, because they don't have the same kind of lobbying power. But if you look at the FBI, they do this stuff all the time, and they get away with it all the time. And to get a sense of why that is, you have to take a look at, let's say, Dianne Feinstein recently complaining that the CIA was going into the senators' computers. Other people telling either publicly or privately that they've been threatened. I remember one U.S. senator once said to me, Russ, what do you think is the biggest industry in Washington? And I said, well, is it government and then maybe lobbying? And he said, maybe, but I would say the most powerful industry in Washington is sexual blackmail. Because we live in this kind of fantasy of perfection, that everybody is, happy with the 10 kids they have, and that their marriage is fantastic, and they go to church regularly and so forth. And so there's nobody who's, a kind of a flawed human being as in terms of the way that they have to sort of campaign and present themselves. And so it creates an impossible situation. There are how many people still in high levels of politics who are closeted, can't talk about their sexual orientation. And it's a real problem. And so they're all sort of trapped. And as you know, if you've ever read any books about J. Edgar Hoover, he was very much in the blackmail business, especially since he was able to stay in the closet, dress up in women's clothes all those years and then harass gay liberation people. So very interesting situations. And this gets me back to the importance of what we're trying to do with Who, What, Why, which is to be honest. We don't consider ourselves liberal or left or right or conservative or libertarian or anything. We feel that our job is to figure out what happened, what's happening, and report it. And believe it or not, there are a lot of things you can do in journalism that involve objectivity. Either there are 3 people sitting in those chairs or there aren't. Either there's a guy running a camera or 2 guys running a camera, or they're not. Now, somebody could say, well, there's only 1 guy running a camera because I don't see anybody at the other camera. I would say, well, he's just he's kneeling down or something. So, these are things that can be factually resolved. And so, drones, do they kill the people that they're wanting to kill? And the people they wanted to kill, did they have any justification to kill them? These are mostly things that we can investigate and we can solve. And we think it's a real public service. And more than that, it's absolutely crucial to the vitality of the democracy and indeed even to our future as a free country and as a viable civilization that we do this kind of work. Anyway, I can go on and on and on. I have absolutely no idea how long I've been talking, but why don't we do this? I think Rich has this idea to break up into groups and chat. Do you want to do that now? Or do you want me to talk longer? Sure. Okay. Is that story interesting to you? Because I can talk about almost anything. I mean, that's just a very hot one. The reason I like that, it's what I would call deep politics in real time. You'll see in Family of Secrets that I discovered some really astonishing things about the Kennedy assassination, about Watergate, about a lot of these things. And I discovered that many of these traumas in this country are always presented as these complicated, convoluted things you can never get to the bottom of. It turns out you can get to the bottom of them. And most of them have the same cast of characters until those people pass from the scene, and then their children seem to take on the mantle. And so this is what you call deep politics, which is the idea that there's politics and then there's deep politics. And what I mean is there's the sort of superficial stuff, Sarah Palin is annoying, or Dick Cheney is evil or something like that. But that's the kind of, I call that the cartoon version of history. The reality is these people don't operate on their own. There are groups of people who say, who should we run? Dick Cheney was told to become the CEO of Halliburton. I mean, he was on a hunting trip, and the guys came in and said, Dick, we decided you're going to be the CEO of Halliburton. He said, oh, okay. And then, they decided somehow he was going to be vice president. And so these people don't do this in a vacuum. There's a whole sort of culture and a system that perpetuates these things. And what frustrates me is that when you talk about these things, they attack you. And they use these pejorative terms. My favorite one is conspiracy theorist, which actually doesn't mean anything. It just means you don't accept a conventional version. Now, of course, there are people who, as I was recently in England, they call them the nutters, which are people who just always assume some convoluted scenario and that nothing is ever as it appears, which is not right either, or some just incredibly fantastic thing that you could never figure out how that would possibly be done. But there are a lot of things that are not the way we're told, and it is the instinct of institutions of all kinds to cover up. And this is not surprising. I mean, if any of you have children, you don't tell the kids everything, do you? No, so you're sort of covering up, or you wait until they're old enough or something. But you have to think about that. The U.S. government says, let's wait until the American public is old enough, and then we'll tell it. So they just don't. We're never old enough, and they can't tell us. And so it goes back to stuff like that, the polio vaccine, where, do you remember that, the first round, and they gave it to all these kids, and they got polio. I'm trying to remember, wasn't Salk, but one of these doctors in New Orleans wanted to show how safe it was, and he gave it to his kids, and they got polio, and so they were all horrified, and they had to cover this up because it would just destroy them, the faith in the system, and so on. And so this is always going on, and that's the importance of doing the journalism. Anyway, Boston bombing, real-time deep politics, because that first week, the second I heard that this thing happened, I went, oh boy, because I don't know what it is. Maybe it's so many years of looking at those color-coded alerts, and then they don't turn into anything, and the timing of them always around elections and things like that. And I thought, these people are taking advantage of us, and they're using, they're tightening the screws at key moments, and why wouldn't they do that? That's a very valuable control mechanism. And so looking at the Boston bombing, somehow, because I had been thinking that ever since 9/11, there really were zero, as far as I know, real terrorist attacks on U.S. soil. Now, you have to think about, they all tell us we have to be afraid of Muslims, but how many Muslims live in this country who didn't commit a terrorist act? Millions of them. I meet them every day in New York City driving cabs and, give me a sandwich or something, and they're basically pretty nice, law-abiding people. And so I thought, what was this all about? And I thought, how do they sustain this? Because if you go back to the early 90s, anybody remember the peace dividend? Anybody remember that? It didn't happen. We were told that's the end of history. Remember Francis Fukuyama or whatever, and the end of history, and it's all over now. And swords shall be beaten into plowshares and so forth. And it didn't happen. And in fact, there was no reduction of any note in the military spending. And then, in addition to all of that and all the foreign threats, then we got Homeland Security, this giant boondoggle, which is the greatest cash cow for all these companies. And by the way, I encourage you to, if you have a stock in any of these outfits or something, just read the annual reports in these companies, because they actually say, people are afraid and the world's in chaos. Looks like it's going to be a pretty good year for us. They basically say that. And so anyway, so the Boston bombing. So I don't know what happened to me. I just get these instincts, and I was just reading somewhere that instincts aren't real. They talk about the debate over noetic sciences. I don't know, but I get instincts all the time, and they're probably not instincts scientifically. They're probably, you collect a lot of data and it processes somehow. But anyway, whatever it is, that as soon as I heard about that bombing, I was like, oh my God, I get a bad feeling about this one. It's too perfect. It's tax day. It's what they call Patriots Day. It's the Boston Marathon, this, hallowed family event, in Boston, the home of the American Revolution. And these bombs go up, and I say, oh boy, I got a bad feeling about this. So the next day, we were doing some fundraising because Who, What, Why is we don't take any corporate money. We're a nonprofit, so all the money comes from folks, regular people. And so I was talking to somebody who's involved with fundraising at a large university, and she was sort of going to give us some advice. And then she said, what do you think about that Boston bombing? Do you think there's more to the story? And I paused, and then I said, I do think there's more to the story. And she said, what do you mean? And I said, well, from my experience, I wouldn't be surprised if it turns out that whoever did it or whoever we are told did it turns out to have more connections than they will admit, and that there may be some more awareness on the part of the authorities than they're going to admit. And this woman became so angry at me. I mean, she's like 92 years old, and she's still working, and she's a big, liberal Democrat, and she just began almost like shaking, and she kind of wanted us out of her place. And later we were downstairs meeting with her staff, and she came in and she said, we have other things to do, and she wanted us out. It's very upsetting. This stuff is very, very upsetting. It causes cognitive dissonance, and particularly for people who are out there waving flags all the time and saying my country right or wrong and so on. This stuff just doesn't compute. It rubs like, fingernails on a chalkboard. And so people fight this stuff, and they call you names, or they just become furious. But I had a feeling, and then the next day nothing happened. You remember there was, very briefly, they said there was a Saudi guy they had held, and there was another guy who just disappeared. And by the way, they found his body in a river. That story was never followed up on. These are all people who were early mentioned in relation to the story. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, people are nervous. The media is doing its usual Malaysia Air style non-coverage. Nothing's going on. There's this weird thing on Wednesday. They suddenly announce that they have some suspects, and they're at the courthouse, and suddenly there's a bomb threat. And the courthouse is evacuated. Nothing ever comes of that. That was weird. Thursday, nothing's happening. And suddenly, 5 o'clock, whoop, there they are. Do you remember that? If you had your TV on, suddenly, just out of nowhere, they go live to this press conference. And there's the head of the FBI office there. And suddenly, they got these images up there. Very incriminating images. People at a sporting event wearing hats and backpacks. Wow. But I sort of looked at that, and then I noticed that everybody else had hats and backpacks. I wasn't sure what it was about these guys, and they said, these are suspects. And I thought, well, why are they suspects? That's interesting. And they said, we don't know who they are. If anybody has any information, please come forward. That was 5 o'clock on Thursday. Later in the evening, we heard suddenly that a police officer had been shot. And I was like, oh my God, that's like the Kennedy assassination. Remember, they didn't know who had shot the president. Suddenly a police officer is shot, and then they identify, supposedly Oswald dropped his wallet. I mean, shot the guy and left his wallet and all his business cards so everybody could get in touch with him, And, this was sort of similar and kind of weird. Oh, and then a little later, carjacking. And then this guy escapes from the car, and the first thing he does is he says, this guy carjacked me. But it wasn't enough that he had a gun. I don't know about you, but if a guy has a gun and he carjacks me, I'm pretty much going to do whatever he wants. But apparently that wasn't enough, so the man had to say to him, do you know who I am? And he said, you're a guy with a gun. He said, no. I'm the Boston Marathon bomber. And he said, oh, I also just shot a police officer. And I thought, that is the weirdest darn thing, because honestly, you want the driver, if you're carjacking him, to just kind of be calm and not imagine a larger scenario, just that he wants to drive you and that's it. So that seemed very strange to me. And then we began looking at all these things. We looked at the shooting of this police officer. They made a huge big deal about the fact what a hero he was, a first responder, they say. A year later, they still say, it's all a lie, and it's disgraceful, and it really is tragic because obviously his family, I'm sure I can't talk to them about this because they want to be proud of him. Well, they should be proud of him because he was a good police officer at MIT, and the kids liked him, and that's enough. But he was not a hero in anything. This original story they put out, and if you ask people what happened, they say, oh, they shot him in he was trying to stop them. And, that's not what happened. It took days and weeks for this to come out, and almost nobody knows the real story. The real story is not only did he not confront them, he never saw them. And, they finally said, oh, well, he was sitting in his car on the street and they came along and they wanted to take his gun. Well, that's not what happened either. What happened was he was sitting in his car wedged between buildings on a completely dark campus. Now, why would they even be on the campus? You're fleeing for your life, supposedly, the FBI showing your pictures, and you're going to go to a darkened campus to see if you can find a cop sitting between two darkened buildings, and then you're going to shoot him in the head and not take his gun? It doesn't make any sense. And so what we do at Who, What, Why is we just go, I like to say I went to the Colombo School of Journalism. I just go, I just don't quite, I can't see, I can't quite, why? It doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't make any sense to me. And so that didn't make any sense. And then this took me almost 9 months of looking at the story of the carjacking victim. By the way, who knows the name of the carjacking victim, since he's the one who was the recipient of the confession? Anybody know their names? His name? Danny? What's his last name? It's just Danny? What's your name? Devin, do you have a last name? Oh, what's Danny's? See, isn't that a little strange? We don't know Danny's last name. It actually turns out Danny is not his first name. Until recently, something weird is happening again. They never showed his face. He was always in shadow. They altered his voice, and they never told us who he was. So here's the guy who has the confession. The reason we think those two kids did it is because of him. Because otherwise, what did they show us? One guy got mad at me. This guy's a journalism professor who lives in Boston. He said, we know they did it. I said, well, how do you know it? He said, we saw them planting the bombs. So I said, you saw them planting the bombs? He said, it was all over TV. I said, wait a minute. What are you talking about? It turns out they never showed us them planting bombs. They've released some stills, and we'll have some articles about whether those stills are real or accurate and what they actually show. But it's just one thing after another. It's like they got an endless bag of tricks. And so you look at this stuff and you say, none of this adds up. This Danny, by the way, we found that he told different versions to different news organizations. In some, he was carjacked for 90 minutes, which is a really long time. It's a small area there in Boston. Where would you go for 90 minutes? Another account was 60 minutes, which is still pretty long. Another one was 30 minutes. And another one was, get this, that he was not carjacked at all. He actually told that to a news organization early on. He said that they just took his car. It's astonishing. This is the biggest story in the country, and nobody seems to know any of this stuff. And so we write about all this, and we found many, many more things about that story. It goes on and on and on. I mean, it's truly staggering. You can see photos that have been altered, statements that they made that make no sense. We're working on about 5 or 6 stories right now, so I don't want to say too much about them, but it's really unbelievable. And for an investigative journalist, this is almost like a dream story, because it's like an Easter egg hunt. The stuff that is wrong is everywhere. And yet nobody's looking at this. The media is not looking at this. And you could say, well, I could ask you who you like. Public radio, not looking at this. Liberal weekly and biweekly magazines, not looking at this. Websites that are progressive, blogs with a lot of traffic, not writing a word about any of this. There's a complete silence. And for anybody who lived in Weimar, Germany, or lived in Chile or Argentina or something, this is a very terrifying time, folks, because nobody's doing anything and nobody's saying anything. There is a conspiracy of silence. And so I do want to start wrapping up here, but what I'd like to say is this: it doesn't have to be that way. It does not have to be that way. This is interesting. I think you'll agree this is interesting stuff. People who like to, when you go on vacation and you see all those guys with the Marine stuff or whatever, and they're all reading thrillers about spies and the FBI and stuff like that, but it's all made up stuff. And you say, well, why not take the real stuff and pay some attention to it? Because it's really as or more interesting. It's pretty incredible. In fact, what I find amazing is that we are convinced we have very little free time. We have very little bandwidth for things outside ourselves. And so that time that we spend absorbing things, we're told to watch lots of movies with battles in them, whether it's hobgoblins battling on some amazing set that cost $200 million, or it's people battling for their lives on a ship going down or something like that. We watch all these and we don't think about why we spend so much time on it. Sports, football, which is simulated battle. The wars on TV, which is, again, a kind of simulated battle with the drone strikes and all that. And then just the gossip, the amount of time that we all spend on things like this Pistorius case. I mean, I'm sorry that he shot his girlfriend, but I never even heard of the guy until recently. We shouldn't really be spending that many hours debating, these horrible stories with a mother who drives her kids into the water because it's a tragedy. But we didn't know him. We can't do anything about it. It's not a policy issue. These are isolated cases of tragedy. And you can fill up all your time. We could fill up all of our TV and everything else with that stuff because you can always find those kinds of things. And I don't think it's an accident. I think it's deliberate. It's easy. It's low-hanging fruit. It doesn't expose news organizations to high costs or any kind of risks. And they love it. So what we're trying to do is get folks to say, you know what, I'm going to watch less of that stuff and so on. And what I'm going to do is try to find a way to make this real stuff interesting to other people, and I'm going to share it. And so what I think all of you can do at a minimum, and this is really, really easy, is use social media to spread the word. And also just talk to people. Go to events and talk to people. Because if each of you regularly talks to 3 or 4 people and lets them know these things, and educate yourself, get armed with the specifics and tell the kind of stories I'm telling, people are going to find it interesting. I mean, I do it on my own level. Over the years, I had lunches with the people like Dan Rather and whatever, and they would just say, wow, you're blowing my mind. And now Dan tweets our stories, after what happened to him, but still, it takes him a while. We get notes privately. A guy at the Boston Globe sent me a note the other day praising something we had done. I mean, he'll never write a word, but at least he praises. So there's a food chain going on there, and I was describing us as we're sort of the phytoplankton of the information food chain. Everybody's got to eat the stuff, and it'll move its way up. So I'm going to stop with that, I guess, and I know we're going to do some Q&A. Do you want to go right to that, or do you want to go to groups, or? The question, I'm going to repeat these for the microphone. The comment was that there are certain points where the system becomes very, very vulnerable, that there are these kind of deficiencies become so pronounced. And this gentleman was saying he thinks this is one of those times. Do I agree? And if so, what are some of those pressure points that might be applied? I do agree. I actually feel this is a great time for us, that this is a very hopeful period, believe it or not. If you look at the pace of the revelations, obviously the Edward Snowden thing was very important. Before that, the WikiLeaks stuff, Dianne Feinstein, who really was a card-carrying member of the military-industrial complex, speaking out against the CIA abuses. Senator Grassley, a Republican, who some people say it's because he's a Republican, there's a Democratic candidate, but I think he's always been reasonably outspoken. He's been challenging the FBI about whether they're being candid. He wrote a very tough letter to them. Democratic Congressman Keating from Massachusetts did the same. So I think that on these civil liberties issues, these privacy issues, we can really come together. It's not really a left-right thing. And in fact, one of the frustrating things for me is to see how this country's always divided between left and right, and it's always, they sort of split everybody, and then all the elections are close, and they use these hot button things to get people, usually their emotional, social issues, to get people all worked up, and then that sort of tips the balance. The truth is that the 1% is really, 1/10 or 1/100th of 1%. It's a very small group of people. And within them, there are some actually very fine people who don't like what's happening. So if you actually take the sort of bad people within the 1/100th of 1% or something, they actually are vulnerable because there are a lot of us and there are very few of them. And just understanding who they are and how they operate, they operate in the shadows. It's very important that however they're able to influence someone like Barack Obama or Bill Clinton or Hillary or any of these people is not known. It's not understood. How does that work? What's that mechanism? One of the things I mention to people is, and I'm sorry, I'm going on here because I'm sure there are many more questions, but one of the things that always strikes me is they say, why does Obama do this or why doesn't he do that? Well, I mean, this guy was an Illinois state senator 6 years before he was president. I mean, he didn't know much. I mean, he's intelligent, a constitutional law professor. They play all that up, but what did he really know about any of these things? Even on constitutional law, he hasn't acted like a constitutional law professor. And the problem is, they always say the president's getting his briefing. And my question is, well, who's briefing him? Who are they? We never hear that, and they, a bunch of guys with crew cuts come in and say, Mr. President, here are your options. There's this and there's that. We can go into Syria and bomb a little, or we can go into Syria and bomb a lot. Which one would you prefer? So the whole thing's kind of rigged to get outcomes that these constituencies within the government want. But I think that I think that this area of rights and the clampdown in Boston, I hear people all over the so-called political spectrum being upset about that. That's why I think this Boston story, we need to stay on it. I'm hoping we can raise some more money because we need to put more reporters on that thing and really scramble all over every lead and just stay on it. So I think that itself is probably the biggest one right now. Yes. The question was about somebody's website and had I seen it, and he was just mentioning about what may or may not have happened when the bombs went off, if they went off, et cetera, et cetera. My default to most of these things is to apply logic. I saw pictures of people with missing limbs. I assume those are real missing limbs. I mean, I think those people have relatives and neighbors and stuff, and if they fake that, I do think that would probably become known. Whether it's possible that there was more to the scene, we do know that there was a drill taking place almost contemporaneous with this, just as with 9/11, there were drills going on at the same time. That concerns me because that's a common intelligence technique that you have multiple things going on. In my book, Family of Secrets, where I talk about the Kennedy assassination, this is, I don't think, ever been reported anywhere. The week of the Kennedy assassination, it has been mentioned a few places that they were holding this bottlers convention, people who were soda bottlers, but they didn't mention that there was something like 8,000 of them, complete strangers, poured into Dallas, and were all there at the time. This is the kind of way that you can create cover for military movements, for all sorts of things. And so I think that we need to be wise and we need to be awake, and we need to know that these are the kinds of things that are taught at the military war colleges. They're certainly taught when you're in intelligence agencies, the use of deception and distraction and so on. I think we need to be open to all of it, but at the same time we need to be cautious and we need to be responsible. And it is a problem for serious investigators that there are always people proposing scenarios that sound so kooky that it sort of taints the serious inquiries. And we're very aware of that, and we're very, very careful about that. Lady in back. Sure. The question was, I had mentioned earlier about Cheney being told he'd be the head of Halliburton. Can I name names? Yeah, I mean, there may be in my book. I think you can look that up. There was a hunting trip of a number of men. I think we know the names of them. And it's that circle around, sort of the Bush family. A lot of those companies like Brown and Root, and later became Kellogg Brown and Root, and Dresser Industries was controlled by a group of people that the Bush family was involved with back to the 1920s. These are these different companies providing different kinds of oil services and so on. And they have all these interlocking boards of people who are on this and on that and so on, and they all know each other. And, I mean, that's pretty much how things happen everywhere. I mean, how did somebody become the new head of Microsoft? I mean, they don't decide they're going to be the head of it. Somebody else decides that. So I think that's just the way things work. Sir, back there. Yeah, you. Yeah, the question is, numbers show that a large majority of Americans believe that John F. Kennedy was not killed by one person, that there was a larger operation there. And how, what does that mean that people believe that stuff? people are very comfortable living with internal inconsistencies. And they're perfectly happy to say, oh, yeah, we know, yeah, probably it was the mob. Or, see, the thing is, there are many variations on the conspiracy. It was the mob. It was some disgruntled element. It was a conspiracy, but it was the Russians who were the conspirators. It was the Cubans, or it was anti-Castro Cubans. There are many, many variations. If you, to actually do a proper a poll, you would have to actually, you would find that the public would break down into lots of different groups with different theories. If you talk about what percentage actually agrees with the dominant theory of the skilled researchers, the sort of people who've spent decades studying this, there is a general consensus that what happened to John F. Kennedy was some kind of a coup d'etat. That it was very similar to coup d'etats that the United States has been involved in Guatemala and Iran and the Congo and so many different places. Do you need some water? Are you okay? All right. There really is a kind of a consensus on that. I don't know where the public is at accepting that, because, again, this is about the mythology. It's about basically America is a good country, and although it does some bad things, the people themselves are inherently good. And so the idea is, yeah, it's true they kill democratically elected people in other countries, but they would never do it here. To which I would reply, well, why would you not take action when the stakes are the highest? If you've got a big company and the Kennedy administration is coming after you, you're not going to sit by. If you didn't sit by when Allende was going to maybe nationalize your bottling plant, why would you sit by when your whole company potentially is threatened at its base? And so I'm not sure how evolved the public is on that, but I do think over the years more and more people accept that. And yet what's quite extraordinary is if you look at the best-selling books on the Kennedy assassination, there are 2 or 3 or 4 of them that are all say that Lee Harvey Oswald did it. And they get all the ink. If you go to the universities and you go to the bookstore and you see what's on the reading list, it's all baloney. And if you go to, again, your favorite, NPR, PBS, this and that, and this and that, The Nation magazine, they all say that the Warren Commission was right. Now, how is that possible that those good institutions stick to the original story if 60 to 80% of Americans don't buy it? I mean, this is the kind of thing we need to explore. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, the question is, how is it then that the media acts as it does and is so sort of blind, willfully or otherwise? I've spent years thinking about this. I think that the stuff like the term conspiracy theorist has been so effective in sort of inoculating the establishment that journalists know. And by the way, things like what happened to Dan Rather, every so often there's something like that. You probably know about this, the Rolling Stone journalist who died in a one-car crash, the one who did the story about a general, General McChrystal in Afghanistan and so on. I mean, we were one of the few news organizations that started looking at his crash, what he was working on at the time and so forth. And then it really came out very quickly in the media, somebody says he had some kind of a drug problem and he was this and that or depressed. They always do that. Well, maybe and maybe not, and we need to look at these things. But I think that there is basically, let me put it this way about journalists. Journalists are like everybody else. They like their job. They enjoy the perks. Kids in college, whatever it is, they want to keep their job, and they know you cannot stick your neck out. In Australia, they call it cutting the tall poppies. The people like to say, if you're in Australia, if you stand out as really excellent, people want to cut you down. So they have this kind of brain drain, people leaving Australia because of that. In the United States, if you want to stay in journalism, you know what to do and what not to do. And when you don't, when you get out of line, bad things happen to you. And so people say, well, look, I'll do what I can, which isn't a lot. I'll do what it is. So the whole system itself is rotten, basically. And that's why we need to invent a whole new journalism. That's why we started Who, What, Why. We don't plan to be small. We plan to be big. With your help, we plan to grow into a major international news organization. We keep our costs low, but we still need support, and we're looking to bring people on board working for us all over the world, and online and video and audio, and tell stories with graphic novel, comic book style drawings and everything, whatever we have to do to reach people. And we particularly, of course, want to reach the younger generation. I mean, here we are right near a college campus, and I'm guessing most of you are not college students, How do we reach them? And what are they doing? They're all off watching House of Cards or something, about how evil the system is, So let's see. Yeah, right there. The question was there any evidence of private contractors being involved in intelligence work around the Boston bombing? There is. I mean, there were all those people. I'm sure you've seen this. It's all over the internet. All these guys with the black hats and black backpacks. And as soon as the bombs went off, they immediately were sort of taking control of the scene. It's quite astonishing that a year later, it has never been firmly established who those people are. We are told that some of them were in insignia for a contractor called Kraft International. We've looked at that. We're continuing to look at that. But it's quite amazing in this country that, I mean, you would think that, do you remember that video of that night they had arrested a young man who looks quite a bit like Tamerlan Tsarnaev? They had him stripped naked. They had him on the ground, and then you see them bundling him into a squad car. Their mother said that was her son. And then later, supposedly, he dies in a shootout. I mean, the authorities were almost never questioned about this, even though it was on Fox and all the channels. You could see, if you go online, you can still watch this thing. Just type in, arrest and Boston bombing, April 15. It's amazing. How could that not be interesting to the New York Times and the Seattle Times and the Boston Globe, that they're not interested in a man who looks exactly like the terrorist was in custody? And then, and so somebody did ask him, and you know what they said? They said, oh, yeah, that was another guy. Well, who was that, please? If you arrested somebody, we ought to be able to know who was arrested. It's just staggering. Rich Lang, I think, had a question. Yeah, the question was, have we done anything on this rash of suicides of people in the financial industry? Very interested in that. Our problem is we're small, and we're already way overextended. We get, I cannot tell you how many things every day with people saying, you really need to look into this thing, or I'm being harassed, or whatever it is, and we don't have the capacity. So we're trying to, I don't want to talk about money, the filthy lucre, but we need more money so we can hire more people and get on these things. That story is very high on my list, because those are people at all these big banks who supposedly were aware of and were privy to, billion-dollar scams affecting all of us. So obviously, if all these people suddenly, go ill or jump out of windows, we ought to take a look at that. Again, the media is completely AWOL, not doing anything. It's just bloggers who bring that stuff to our attention. Let's see who else. Okay, sir, with that, yeah. The question was, what do I think the role of those brothers was? Well, I don't know, and I never want to state with any kind of sureness, because the whole nature of what we do is to keep our minds open and keep digging. But the very fact that the FBI was so involved with him, the fact that, this letter that Grassley sent, which is in one of our articles, you have to read this, it's quite amazing. He sent a letter to Comey, the head of the FBI, asking all these questions, including, did you know who these guys were before, when you said you didn't know who they were? What was the extent of your involvement with them? And he actually says, I think you ought to know, there's a statistic which the New York Times published, that out of 22 potential plots, like where supposedly somebody was thinking of doing something or something was discussed, 22 potential terrorist plots in the United States, 14 of them involved FBI informants. In other words, that's a majority of them, at least, were people who were encouraged to go and stir something up. And so we'll have more on our site about this. Just the other day, there's a report, all these Muslims said they were told they were going on the no-fly list unless they became informants. The FBI, throughout its history, has had thousands of these people, thousands. In Family of Secrets, I reveal an FBI program I don't think was ever known before, working with the American Legion, where the American Legion offered, I think American Legion has maybe it had like 1 million members or something, and they were going to all spy on their coworkers and stuff to see if anybody was a pinko. And they originally, it was offered to the Roosevelt administration, and they said, absolutely not. You can't do that. Absolutely not. And then, as far as my research shows, Hoover went ahead and just privatized it and did it. And they did it for 30 or 40 years, collecting information on their neighbors and everybody and giving it to the FBI. So I think that we need to take a hard look at what these agencies really are, if they actually work for us or not. Somebody here was pointing out to me during the break that a very politicized outfit from the beginning. I mean, what they did about black people and gays and Native Americans and every other group you could think of. I mean, it's always been a kind of a shock troops of reaction, very responsive to the interests and needs of corporations. And, I, for one, who covered the fall of Ceausescu and fall of the Berlin Wall and all these other places, I can tell you that, I mean, these kind of state police are of a type. And I don't think everybody's bad in any of those outfits. They get in there as a careerist thing, or they're young and idealistic, or maybe they're in there trying to do the right thing. But then I don't mean, if any of you are in the FBI, I don't mean that you're necessarily bad. But it is a problem that they're spying on the rest of us and intimidating people. And remember the guy down in Florida? He was a friend of Tamerlan Tsarnaev, and they were interrogating him, and then they shot him dead. He was unarmed. Any way you look at that, you have to ask, would he really attack an armed FBI agent? Did he? I mean, it turns out the guy had just had knee surgery. They made it out that he was this, martial arts guy. Well, maybe so, but it was a martial arts guy with knee surgery, And he told his friend he was afraid something bad was going to happen to him that night. And we'll have more on that on the website. In the back there. Right, so the question is, the gentleman is pointing out that in some ways we need less privacy about certain interests, particularly those that are driving things behind the scenes. I totally agree. In fact, if you think about the paradox, all the wrong people are being spied on. We're not doing anything, and they got cameras everywhere, and they're watching what we're doing on the internet, and they use this stuff. You know what's about that? They use stuff like child pornography. They always find something because they've done all their tests, and they know that people will be upset when they when they wanted to get rid of Gaddafi. And you can read on Who What Why. One of our fans, Bill Moyers, was asked. He was asked, what he likes to read anymore, and he mentioned two publications, and one was Who What Why, and he said it was really where he went to find out what was really happening in Libya. And I have to say, your favorite alternative TV show, I'm sure you know what I mean. It's a show that's on every night, and a liberal left show. They almost all their guests were in favor of bombing Libya and bombing Syria and all this because the government, Obama's a Democrat, his base is liberal, so they had to convince everybody that this was good intervention, not bad intervention, and they did it. They pulled it off. And the thing with Gaddafi, the thing with Assad, it's the same thing. They had no problem with these people before. Those people hadn't changed at all, but the plan changed. And if you don't believe it, go to Who What Why and type in the search box General Wesley Clark and watch Wesley Clark. One is a speech he gave to an organization in San Francisco, and the other is a private interview he gave to one of our people on camera. And he says that right after 9/11, he was at the Pentagon and he was shown a memo that listed 7 countries that the U.S. planned to invade using 9/11 as an excuse. They've been talking about this stuff, the Project for a New American Century. This goes all the way back to 92. Wolfowitz and Pearl and Cheney and Rumsfeld under George H.W. Bush, they decided as soon as the Soviet Union started collapsing, they said, we can be the world's only superpower, and the key thing is we need to be able to go in anywhere we want to go in without anybody asking any questions. But they realized the American people would never go for that, and the rest of the world would never go. So they need to invent these excuses. Now, with Gaddafi, they knew that women are generally anti-war, so they made up stories about rape. And suddenly, that it is true. Women and men do care about different things. And as soon as the story went out that Gaddafi was ordering his troops to do mass rape, you could see the poll numbers shift among women. Now it's time to start bombing. And this is how cynical this stuff is, that it's all studied and it's all planned, and it works. It really, really, really works. Yeah. So the question was, what do I think about the bin Laden removal. And why would the American people believe that story after all the lies that we've been told? Is that pretty much? Okay. So again, it sounds kind of funny because for a tiny organization, we've covered almost all of these things. Again, we're the only ones. Right after that, we started writing pieces. You'll see my byline on a lot of them. Fortunately, as we're bringing on more people, my byline doesn't dominate quite so much. But one of the questions I asked right away was, I mean, of course, we had been told for years that, he was ill, he was dead, he had died years before, and so on. But what interested me, there were many facets of that story that interested me, but just on the surface, they said that there were 2 helicopters involved. One of them crashed, and everybody got out fine. I don't know, any of you were in the military, you probably know, when a helicopter crashes into a wall, I mean, everybody isn't fine. I mean, it's just, those are somewhat delicate crafts. I mean, any plane crashes into a wall, I mean, everybody isn't fine. So, they said everybody walked away from that. And I remember reading in an Indian newspaper, I think it was, they interviewed the next door neighbor who had been on his roof at the time, and he said that plane crashed and they all died. Now, what is it? And of course, if they crashed and they all died, what would have happened? I mean, Obama wouldn't have been reelected because Fox News would have been all over him forever. That's unacceptable. Look what happened to Jimmy Carter with the failed hostage thing, which there are questions about whether that was sabotaged. But do you remember about a month later, this was this SEAL Team 6, and then about a month later, another group of SEALs, SEAL Team 6, about the same number, died in an unrelated thing. Their plane was shot down. Now, we never saw the names. I mean, could it be that the people who died in the original thing, that they made up the story later to cover up the fact that the whole thing had been a disaster? I don't know. But a good journalist ought to be looking into this stuff. Now, another thing that's strange is their rush to throw the body into the sea. I mean, that's just not standard operating procedure. I'll tell you something else. It's also not standard operating procedure when all your country does is chase and obsess about terrorists to just kill the guy who has all the information instead of interrogating him. And they claimed, listen to this, they left it up to the SEALs to decide what to do with him. Now, do you believe that the Pentagon, the CIA, the president would say, yeah, you know what, take him out for an ice cream sundae, whatever you think is, I mean, it's astonishing. And the failure of these major news organizations, and again, your favorite alternative show, none of them asking a single question about any of this. Sponsored by Lockheed. Yeah, sure. Yeah. So just not to go on too much about this point, although this is one of my favorite ones actually because it's so ludicrous. A few months later, they interviewed Brennan. Why did they throw the body in the ocean? Remember they originally said, do you remember the reason? Anybody remember? Why did they throw his body in the ocean? They didn't want the body to be honored. I mean, who cares? Well, first of all, what were they expecting? That stadiums were going to be filled? I mean, it's just insane. It doesn't, they don't care about that with anybody else. I mean, it's just absurd. Plus, you could have buried it in an unmarked grave somewhere. Nobody would have known. So that doesn't make any sense. And then they say, later they changed it. Oh, well, why did they throw it in the ocean? They changed it. See, they always change the story and the media doesn't notice this stuff. But that's the story. They said, Brennan said, Brennan used to be the head of the CIA station in Saudi Arabia, where Osama bin Laden's family is to this day extremely influential. So he says, oh, yeah, we asked the Saudis what we should do with the body, and they said throw it in the sea. Oh, we just asked the Saudis, and that's what we do? I mean, it's insanity. There are dozens and dozens of things about this story that don't add up. Anything is possible. I mean, he could have already been dead. They could have faked this thing. The guy in that house might not have been him. If you look at the pictures, it doesn't look like him. This guy liked to watch porn. I really don't think Osama bin Laden watched porn. I mean, I may be wrong, but I don't think so. There was never any indication that he did. If you look at these two guys, have you seen the pictures? The nose, the ears look pretty different. Maybe his ears grew a lot in a few years. I don't know. I mean, my point is, these guys lie to us all the time. You know, it's like, you remember Charlie Brown and Peanuts, and Lucy says, I'm going to hold the ball and you come running up and kick it. And then he says, I'm not doing that, because last time I did, I go flying and I fall and I kill myself. And she goes, yeah, well, I'm not doing that anymore. I go, come on. And then he does it, and what happens? I mean, we got to turn to Charles Schultz for some wisdom about how to handle this stuff. You know, so I probably don't want to keep you too much longer. You have maybe time for a couple more questions? Or? Okay, ma'am. The question was about the militarization of police departments in the United States, with it being a very significant factor here in Seattle and federal funds coming in, and what can people do about it. First of all, these are not ringers in the audience, but that's another story we've written about at Who, What, Why. We're almost alone in covering that. There have been a few articles here and there. We've tried to do it on an ongoing basis. We actually spoke to a police chief who said he didn't want that stuff, didn't need it. And as we pointed out in our most recent article, the crime rates all over the country have gone down. There's a corresponding, you know, the more they ramp up with this stuff, the less there's a justification for it. And this is pretty alarming, because this is how you get a police state, a military police state. And you know, so what can we do, and how can we make people care? I think, honestly, people just are not really, you know, they say you have to expose people to the same information at least 3 times before it registers, you know, so on and so forth. So I think that, you know, we have one fellow who's one of our donors, and he just sends stuff to his brother regularly. And eventually the brother started reading them and started paying attention to it. I think it's just it's a numbers game. You wear them down with good information, stories well told. Yes, sir. Back there. What role the Koch brothers are playing? And yeah, it is true the Koch brothers are these almost like, again, you know, cartoon evil. I'm certainly interested in them, but you see, the very fact that the media covers them so heavily, and particularly the left alternative media, makes me suspicious that maybe they're not as important as they're presenting them as. Because my rule is, if the media pays a lot of attention to something, it can't really matter. And I would say that they're a distraction. And they volunteered to be, like Karl Rove, the lightning rod, so that we focus on them rather than the fact that this is actually a phenomenon that's much, much broader than them. That's my take on that. Sir, here. Yeah. The question was, how do we find out who's pulling the strings, and how do we break their power without a revolution? I would argue that, gentlemen, I can't even remember if I fully answered his question. It was about secrecy, and that we need more transparency. We need to shine more of a light, and I think that goes to your question as well. We need to know a lot more about these people. We need to vigorously demand our rights in the release of records. We have a very good Freedom of Information Act, which has been sort of whittled down a bit under the clauses of the war on terror. Police departments that used to have to give us reports now say it's an ongoing investigation. That's a story we want to do. They say that about everything, and supposedly it's an ongoing investigation. They're still investigating the Titanic. You know, you can't know about these things. So we need to start demanding accountability. We need to support those few elected officials, whether it's Grassley, and you may be may not be a Republican, and he may be, but support him in his inquiry. Support Ron Wyden from your next door state of Oregon, who's been really outspoken. He and one of his colleagues, Udall in particular, have been very outspoken in complaining about these things. Encourage Dianne Feinstein to keep growing a backbone, you know, and you know, if you sort of piss off the right people, they'll start doing something. The thing is that, you know, it's a sport in the United States to attack and make fun of and undermine elected officials. But the fact of the matter is, we need them. Most of them are not really evil or bad people. They're people like us who, you know, run for office and try to do something. But the system is very tough. It's very hard to make a difference. You see that with a Kucinich or something, who listens to him. And so, you know, I think that those people need support, and they need I'm not talking about just campaign contributions, because I think that's like dumping it all down a mine shaft. And it kind of, I think a lot of that's a waste of money. But I mean, just once they're in there, is to take an interest in the bills that they're sponsoring and get other people to talk about them. There's always a tipping point on these things. You know, if enough people, you probably know that in your community, if somebody's got an eyesore on their lawn or something, I mean, suddenly everybody's out with pitchforks, you know. So there's a tipping point, and I think we have to study on issue by issue. What is that tipping point? What would it take to get people to do things? Ask people, you know, to do small things. Again, will you come hear somebody speak? Will you watch this DVD? Will you look at this website? Will you consider, you know, liking this thing on Facebook? I mean, how hard is that stuff? And it really makes a difference. I mean, I'd love Who, What, Why's, you know, our Facebook thing is going up, but it's kind of like crawling. And I'm thinking, like, why, you know, people love what we do. Why is this not exploding? How hard is it for people to click like or share or something like that? So there are a lot of things that we can do to, and I think there's a point of critical mass. And when you have critical mass, these people respond. Don't forget, they do respond when they sense that the public won't put up with something. I'm sure you can think of examples on many, many things. Certain things get through. I mean, the public wants single payer. They didn't get that, but they got something. And it's better than nothing, despite the tremendous interest arrayed against it. So I think on quite a few issues, we actually do see some progress when we push it over the line there. How about one more question? Somebody have a question that's going to take everybody away feeling all warm and fuzzy or something? Was that your question, sir?
No, I'm just thinking still in elections, Carl Rove and Governor Siegelman.
Oh, more depressing stuff. Okay, yeah.
He's in prison, a sitting governor.
Yeah, this question was about former Governor Siegelman of Alabama is in prison. We actually, you talk about people in Alabama being in prison. We did a story on our website about a blogger who was sent to prison for blogging in Alabama. And he was there for months and months and months. We wrote a number of articles, interviewed him in jail. And then finally the New York Times wrote something, and now he's out of jail. Did the New York Times cause that? Did we cause the New York Times to look and then write something? We don't know. But that's what I'm talking about, being the phytoplankton in the food chain. We are, you know, all these news organizations are beginning to discover us, beginning to look at us going, you know, yeah, Boston thing is kind of strange. Maybe we need to do something on that. There was a young person back there had a question. Somebody under, there you are, okay. One of my sources. You know, people say, what do you like to read? This is going to sound like a cop-out. If I had a lot of really great things to read online, I would never have created Who, What, Why. There really isn't a lot. I mean, I'll tell you, we do a little compilation of headlines from other places. I read the New York Times because it's full of good information. I read the Washington Post. I read the Nation, and I watch these shows. I mean, I absorb all of these things. But frankly, my main source of information is people like you. You see something and you send it to me, and it's kind of like having a large, you know, like Obama's briefing group of the crew cuts. You know, I got my own briefing group, and people are saying, you ought to take a look at this. And I like that. You know, it's kind of like the stuff gets sort of previewed a little bit. And we hear and we see things that we might not otherwise see. People send us stuff from a newspaper in Pakistan or whatever. You have to have your net cast widely. If you get everything you do from some, you know, glossy magazine put out in New York, or you watch one network and you think you're getting the truth, you're really getting a skewed perspective. And by the way, it's very interesting that centers like New York and Washington, the people are the worst informed. Do you know this? We've discovered that a lot of our best informed people are people like you out in America. A lot of them don't even have much of a formal education. They're truck drivers and they're farmers or whatever, and they're self-taught. They read books. They go home at night and they're not all watching, you know, the Tonight Show or something. They're curious and they're reading books. Like this gentleman mentioned a book, you know, there are lots of these different books and blogs, and they're reading this stuff and they're thinking for themselves. And we make a mistake when we look up to these gatekeepers, and people say, well, oh, you should be on Jon Stewart, you know, but I mean, he works for a large corporation that's making money off of that stuff. And, you know, his guests are like Bushes and Cheneys and they yuck it up, you know, it's a great show. I told somebody the other day I was at the Daily Show. They said, finally. I said, yeah, well, I was in the audience, you know. Eventually, maybe they'll invite us on and we won't say no, but the reality is that we don't want these corporate institutions to be defining our worldview for us. And sadly, the chattering class in Washington and New York and LA and stuff, they're kind of in in a little bit of a bubble. You know, it's the Truman Show all over again, you know, and their reality is very, very skewed. And also those people have a stake in the system, you know. All those people who voted for Obama and, you know, they drive a Prius and, they compost, you know, every third Thursday and they, you know, this and that. But, you know, they really, you know, they work for large corporate law firms and who are their clients, you know. So there's that cognitive dissonance. And I think they just, you know, they don't know how to renounce all this stuff because they're, you know, we're all sort of hooked up to the matrix a little bit. But I think the exciting thing, and I'd like to close with this, is that we can pull ourselves off the matrix. I think the fact that you're here is testament to that there is an uprising happening in America right now. We see it with our own site. Our traffic is zooming. More people are contacting us every day. I've been contacted in the last couple of weeks by people from the military, former military and intelligence, and all kinds of people saying, I love what you do, and I have some stories I'd like to share with you. I've been afraid, but I you know, you're giving me encouragement to come forward and share what I know. And I think what's going to happen, I saw this. I covered East Germany, and I was there before the wall came down, and I saw people beginning to rebel. I saw people, there was a meeting at a pastor's home. Churches, by the way, are very important for this stuff. There was a meeting at a pastor's home, and they were already discussing, could we change this totalitarian society? Because there were already cracks in the system. You may remember back in '89, there were all these people starting to go to the embassies in all those Eastern European countries, and so they started having these meetings. And I got on a bus, and a bunch of young people wearing ski masks got on the bus and quickly passed out leaflets and then got off. And then I was driving with a German guy, and we were taking pictures of this giant garbage plant in East Germany that was burning all the garbage for the West Germany because they didn't want the pollution. And we were taking pictures, and we stopped our car by the side of the road, and these two guys got out of this little East German car. They were wearing big ski jackets, and they said, what do you think you're doing? And my friend, who was West German, said, oh, fuck off. And I thought, oh my God, these guys are Stasi agents, you know, we could never be heard from again. And I said, you know, I think you're a little bit overconfident here. And I said, you know, just, you know, and he said, they have no power anymore. And I said, well, it's not, you know, and so I said, listen, you know, you translate, tell them to chill, everything's cool, everybody goes their own way and no problems. And they left because they didn't know. And a few months later, when I went to Romania, I was one of the first journalists to make it into that country when they were supposedly overthrowing Ceausescu, although it turns out he was overthrown by his own people, his own internal security people in a fake, like everything else. But what happened there was that the same kind of thing happened. We were trying to get through the border, and the border office, border police, they wouldn't let us go. And the reporter I was with from Spain was afraid because she'd been turned away, and she thought they'd arrest her. We went into the border station to talk to the head of it, and I said, I'm not worried. She said, why not? I said, look on the wall. What do you see? And she said, nothing. And I said, exactly. On that wall would be pictures of Mr. and Mrs. Ceausescu, and they already took the pictures down, okay? I think what's happening in this country is all of these people who are complicit are starting to take the pictures down. Thank you very much.